Going to make a start. Good evening to you all. My name is David Goodman. I'm director of the China Studies Center. Please welcome you to our international research webinars. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of Australia, recognizing their continuing connection to land, water, and culture, the fact that that land was never ceded, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. So today we're going to hear about a new book, actually, called Fractured China: How State Transformation is Shaping China's Rise. We're being joined by Professor Lee Jones of Queen Mary University in London and Professor Shahar Hameiri from the University of Queensland. They are both well-published scholars of what I would describe as international political economy, but I don't know if they would describe themselves that way. And I'm really looking forward to hearing from them. In fact, never really having spoken to them in any great detail before, it was the fact that I read about their new book that made me think it would be worth inviting them to talk. So over to you, Lee.
Thank you, David, and thank you for inviting us. And good evening to everybody, or good morning from foggy London. See if I can control my slides. So we'll open with a little story that sets the scene for our book. And it's the story of China's record on non-proliferation and North Korea. So on the one hand, Beijing has been quite cooperative with Western powers in trying to restrain North Korea's nuclear ambitions. It has supported at the United Nations Security Council tightening sanctions on North Korea from 2006 onwards. And it hasn't just done that in multilateral settings, it's also sanctioned North Korea bilaterally as well. It has excluded North Korea from the Belt and Road Initiative and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. So on the one hand, China seems to be propping up the global non-proliferation regime. On the other hand, it seems that China seems to be undermining that regime because it is going around the sanctions regime. Investment from China into North Korea has risen quite substantially during the period under which North Korea has been under sanctions. And North Korean exports into China have also risen substantially in the same period. And if we look at what local authorities along the border are doing, they're periodically easing tourism and trade restrictions across the border. And so the United States and others have looked at this behavior and said, it's obvious that China's not serious about non-proliferation. And President Trump, as he then was, tweeted that China had been caught red-handed, undermining the UN efforts. Now, what's interesting about this story is that it's emblematic of a broader problem from China, which is what we might call China's consistently inconsistent international behavior. But on the one hand, it seems to engage in behavior that supports the international status quo, the existing liberal rules-based international order, as it's called. And then on the other hand, it seems to be engaging in behavior that challenges, revises, or even seeks to overthrow that existing order. And that is very difficult for international relations scholars to deal with, to pass, at least in the rising powers debate, which is the central debate in international relations today. The question about China's rise and its impact on international order. The reason why it's difficult to pass for IR scholars is that they tend to treat China and other rising powers as a unitary actor. So therefore, China should either be doing one thing or the other. It shouldn't really be doing both things simultaneously. And because of that unitary actor assumption, which is really quite foundational ontological approach in IR, what you tend to get is a lot of cherry picking and shoehorning. So depending on your theoretical proclivities, you ignore bits of evidence that don't quite fit your model. So when it comes to the North Korea vignette, for example, realists would tend to ignore the evidence of China's commitments to the global non-proliferation regime and say this is not, China's not seriously committed. This is part of Beijing's grand strategy to prop up North Korea and deter the United States. On the other hand, liberals would tend to play up the cooperation side, and they would ignore the evasion side. And the result of this kind of cherry picking is that the debate around rising powers and the impact on international order is inconclusive. It's stalemated basically between people who think that rising powers will overturn international order and those that think that they will basically comply and rise within the existing order. And as a result of that stalemate, the debate has become increasingly speculative. What are these rising powers going to do in the future as they become more powerful? If we take a deeper dive into the specific vignette we've just covered, interestingly, the evasion of UN sanctions is not happening because Beijing has decided through some kind of strategic maneuver to undermine them. Non-compliance has actually been driven by local actors within the party states. It's been driven by Chinese companies who want to offshore production to North Korea, and by provincial governments with an interest in trade and investment and tourism ties with North Korea. Beijing has been largely reactive to these events when they've been discovered. Now, the argument that we make in the book, in Fractured China, is a relatively straightforward one, really, which is that this kind of inconsistent or contradictory behavior manifests because China is not a unitary international actor. Decades of state transformation involving the fragmentation, decentralisation and internationalisation of party-state apparatuses mean that today there are many Chinese actors with often differing interests and agendas operating internationally with considerable autonomy and limited coordination and oversight. And that produces outcomes that don't necessarily reflect any strategic agenda or direct control from the top. And often top leaders' own attitudes and agendas are themselves quite unclear. Now, that idea that China is a fractured state is bread and butter for China specialists. This is nothing new. On the left here, you can see some one of the kind of foundational texts of modern Chinese politics. Lieberthal and Lampton's book on bureaucracy, politics and decision making in post-Mao China. And this develops the idea, floated first in 1988 by Lieberthal and Oskenberg, that China exhibits fragmented authoritarianism. And in the early 1990s, this started to be explored for its implications for China's international politics as well, including by our host today. So in sinology, this idea is almost a kind of consensus that shapes the field. In international relations, on the other hand, on the right-hand side, you can see the focus is very much on China's grand strategy. It's very much on interpreting China as a strategic actor, which implies a high degree of coherence. And here are a couple of texts which take that to its logical extreme. Doshi's The Long Game has literally just been published alongside our own book. And Michael Pillsbury's book, The 100-Year Marathon, which suggests that there's a 100-year-long strategy by the Chinese government to overthrow US hegemony. That implies an amount of foresight and capacity for planning and the rational allocation of resources and so on that is extraordinary. Whereas literature in sinology would suggest that the Chinese government is almost kind of making it up as it goes along. And does not have that kind of level of control, foresight, planning, and so on. That the situation is characterized much more by looseness, broad outlines of direction, and considerable bargaining, undermining, and so on. This is simply just not taken account of in most of the literature on China's international relations. So what we're trying to do in this book is bridge that gap. Why does this gap exist? I think it's because China specialists, obviously China being very big and the field of China studies being very big, it's possible for China specialists to operate within a silo, to write mostly for each other. And therefore, there's a tendency to treat the reform and opening up process that led to fragmented authoritarianism as a sui generis process that is unique to China and needs sort of mostly empirical treatment. There's a tendency to not see what's going on in China as part of a wider development in the state, and a tendency to not develop theory and not to set China into comparative perspective either. And there's a serious lack of good theory from international relations that's capable of making sense of these findings in sinology to communicate to the wider IR discipline. On the other side, in international relations, there has been this strong unitary actor assumption, which has been relaxed in some parts of international relations, but it's very strong in the specific area that we're interested in, which is the rising powers debate. And so IR theory just doesn't have the conceptual apparatus really to make sense of a fragmented actor. And the theory that has emerged to try to relate the domestic to the international is still quite weakly developed in international relations. Even the body of thought that has developed specifically for this foreign policy analysis is quite weakly developed and does not really take account of transformations within the state. So what we are trying to do in this book is to further develop our state transformation approach, which is an approach that we have been developing together for 10 years now. And the foundation of this is Gramscian state theory, which understands the state not as an actor or a person, but as a set of institutions that reflect ongoing struggles for power and resources within evolving political economy contexts. And we see the transformation of states as a general worldwide phenomenon, not something specific to any one country, but reflecting massive shifts in the global political economy since the 1970s. Every society has its own unique dynamics. And in China, that general trend manifests itself in the shift from Maoism to capitalism in the reform and opening up period. But that process of moving from state control to markets is manifests all over the world in lots of different contexts. It's also manifests in the party-state shifting class spaces, which again, David Goodman has written very extensively about the shift from workers and peasants towards an urban middle class, but especially to a highly fractious and factionalized cadre capitalist class, which is interpenetrated in the party state. And then three vectors of transformation within the party state. Firstly, the fragmentation of decision-making, authority and power across multiple different agencies within the party and the state at any one level, which often leads to a great deal of confusion in governance and lack of clarity over who is in charge in particular issue areas, overlapping areas of responsibility, arising from ongoing reforms and tweaks to the party state. Secondly, the decentralisation of power, initiative and authority to subnational governments, and especially important here for our purposes is provincial governments, which now have control over their external economic relations. And finally, the internationalisation of state apparatuses, meaning that agencies originally developed for purely domestic purposes now have an international presence and function. The most obvious of these is state-owned enterprises, which were initially created to develop China's domestic economy, and now are major multinational enterprises operating mostly as profit-seeking actors under relatively weak state oversight. But as we'll see later on, many other actors have also internationalized, from police agencies to central banks and so on. What we theorize in the book, what we try to work out in the book is, given these changes in the party state, how does policy making now occur? How is power exercised in the party state? And this question about how shifts us away from asking whether the center has lost power or whether the center is gaining power. We're trying to understand more, given that state transformation has happened, how does power politics now work within the party state? And we theorize this as the shift from a command and control system of relatively top-down decision-making, where the center is making all the key decisions and controlling to a remarkably kind of minute level of detail the outputs of the Chinese party state, to a Chinese-style regulatory state. In a regulatory state, the central state agencies have withdrawn from the direct control of behaviour to a more regulatory one. Their main function is to set out broad direction of travel, broad objectives, broad targets, and sets of regulations. And then it's for other agencies within the broader kind of ecosystem of the state to work out what this means in practice. So they're given considerable autonomy to pursue these broad goals. Now, the centre retains various mechanisms that it uses to coordinate and steer all these fractured actors. There's party ideology and campaigns. There are senior leaders' statements and slogans. These are often very vague and capacious. Multi-agency leading small groups and commissions of the State Council, the Politburo, and so on, which try to bring agencies together to work out broad consensus in various issue areas. The centre retains a great deal of discretionary control over laws, regulations, and funding, so that anybody wanting to undertake initiatives will be compelled to orient themselves, at least notionally, towards central policy themes. And finally, the most important of all is the CCP's own powers of appointment, the appointment of personnel, appraisal, the cadre responsibility system, and discipline, the capacity to investigate, purge, and even execute people who violate party discipline and rules. So these are quite powerful steering mechanisms, but as many China specialists have observed, although these things all influence how the system works, none of them give the centre total control over the entire party state. And that's because others can engage in a variety of behaviours, which we call the 3 I's: influencing, interpreting, and ignoring these steering mechanisms. Firstly, they can influence. So sometimes what look like these top-down initiatives involving various slogans and policy frameworks actually bubble up from below. Some of these agencies sit on, for example, the leading small groups. They're actually part of these coordinating mechanisms. They can interpret. So often these central mechanisms issue only quite vague and capacious directions, policy frameworks, ideas, and it's up to others to interpret that and work out what that actually means in practice. And that gives them an opportunity to insert their own sectional interests in the process. And then finally, there is evidence that others can ignore what the centre wants, and they can go off and do their own thing, go rogue, ignore certain rules and regulations. Plenty of evidence that that also happens. So in reality, rather than reflecting a top-down strategy, the behaviours emanating from China reflect the ongoing contestation within this fractured party state. And consequently, we don't think that the Chinese party state is capable of engaging in the formulation and execution of grand strategy, because regardless of how this term is used, they all imply a long-term vision, the holistic devotion of state resources, and the prioritisation of key interests and goals. And I think there's limited evidence that a state organised in this way can actually engage in that kind of behaviour. Now, to explain final outcomes on the ground, what actually happens, what is the final product of Chinese behaviour, it's important, we argue, to study how Chinese dynamics intersect with those in states targeted by or those that are receiving Chinese initiatives. So we flip it around. We identify the key actors' interests and agendas on the recipient side using a Gramscian analysis, and we trace out empirically how these actors' interests and agendas on the recipient side interface with those coming out from the Chinese side, and to what outcomes. And Chinese initiatives are often contested in recipient societies because they have very uneven distributional and political consequences. Some people welcome Chinese initiatives and projects, and some people very much try to resist and reject them. So if you want to understand what China's rise really means, you have to take into account the internal transformation within China, but also how that interfaces with dynamics in other recipient states. Over to you, Shahar.
Yeah, thanks, Lee. And I'd like to add my thanks to Lee's for inviting us to speak to you about our book. It is a great pleasure. Thank you very much for that. So in the time that we have, what I'd like to do is give you a little bit of a flavor for what is actually in the book itself. probably the greatest part, which is the case studies. We developed 3 in-depth case studies of how these dynamics of state transformation in China that Lee was just describing manifest in very important areas of China's foreign and security policies. And we also investigate in some of these cases how these intersect with dynamics in the societies in which these activities occur. So our first case study is the South China Sea. This is our, if you like, hard security test case. South China Sea is now seen as one of the world's worst hotspots where the risk of war is the greatest. So we look at that case. We'll be very happy to elaborate on that in the Q&A. The case that I will spend more time talking about is the one in the middle. It's China's attempts to manage criminality and also counter narcotics, the flow of narcotics from the Golden Triangle region to China's southwest into China. And we look at how these dynamics play out in especially opium substitution programs in Myanmar and Laos. And finally, we look at China's international development financing, also in the context of its huge expansion in recent years through the Belt and Road Initiative. And there we look at how Chinese large-scale projects are being essentially implemented and received in Myanmar and Cambodia, with a focus on hydropower dams in the Mekong sub-region. So as I mentioned, my focus is going to be on the middle one in the time that I have. And even there, I don't actually have time to cover everything that we do in that chapter, just to give you a bit of a flavor. So slide, please. Thank you. Now, often when people talk about so-called non-traditional security issues that easily traverse state borders, generally they're understood to be new. But in the case of China's attempts to control the flow of narcotics from the Golden Triangle into China, or to prevent the drugs problem in China, as anyone here with familiarity with Chinese history would know, this is a very long-running concern that dates back all the way to the Opium Wars. So when Mao came to power, one of the things that were done in the first few years of Communist Party rule was to actually eradicate the flow of drugs into China, and also engage in a very brutal drug eradication campaign within China. And that also reflected the kinds of state that Mao was leading, one that was largely autarkic and was closed off from Southeast Asia. Now, from the 1980s, as the border started to reopen in order to help facilitate economic development, especially in Yunnan province and in provinces around those areas in China, the drugs began to reappear, mainly opium and heroin, and later on amphetamine type stimulants, or ATS. And these are they've become seen as a transnational threat to China. So increasingly, and again, this is in the Chinese context nothing new, the flow of drugs has been securitized, been seen as a security problem that the Chinese state has to manage. In 2005, former leader Hu Jintao declared the People's War on Drugs, which involved a whole range of different processes. But as part of that, China has also rolled out opium substitution projects, OSPs, in drug-producing neighboring states, especially in the north of Myanmar, but also in northern Laos, which is the focus here. Now, Chinese agencies, especially the Ministry of Public Security, has been actively participating in United Nations Office of Drug Control, Drugs and Crime, UNODC, MOU on drug control in the greater Mekong region, in the sub-Mekong region, and notionally has incorporated the United Nations Principle on Alternative Development, which essentially describe the process in which opium substitution programs should take place. It needs to be consultative. It needs to be providing developmental opportunities for the people who are growing opium, just to give them an alternative source of development so that they don't have to grow opium. Much of the existing literature on this intervention actually praises China's success in this area, and describes the way in which the opium, the OSPs contributed to a reduction in the drugs problem. And this success, if you want to use more conventional IR theories, whether it's a realist perspective or a liberal perspective, is relatively simple to explain. So from a realist perspective, you would argue that China has identified a security problem in its neighborhood and has engaged state agencies in order to address that problem. From a liberal perspective, you would probably focus on how this is a shared problem that affects not just China but other countries, and China is engaging in these multilateral frameworks. It's engaging with its neighbors constructively to address this shared concern. Slide, please.
Shahar, can I just interrupt for a second? Could you possibly turn your fan off?
Oh, sure, yeah.
Ah, thank you. Sorry about that. Thank you very much indeed.
Can you hear better? I think what you're picking up there is actually the cicadas outside. I mean, this is Brisbane summer.
Yes, unfortunately, you're in Queensland.
Yep, not much I can do about that.
No, it's the cicadas, you're right. Yeah. Thank you.
No, that's okay. Okay, so going back to our own framework, the state transformation approach, we find a very different processes taking place. The first thing to note is the opium substitution programs are not a reflection of any strategy emanating from Beijing, not even really the agency of the lead agencies within that process, like the Ministry of Public Security. It is actually a case of a very bottom-up process of influencing, one of the three I's that Lee mentioned, whereby Yunnan province, which was already conducting similar operations especially in Myanmar, from the 1990s, initially a county and then scaled up to the province. They were lobbying national agencies to incorporate that process in a national program. And that reflects, of course, decentralisation, because Yunnan became the lead province within China to engage with Southeast Asia, especially with the Greater Mekong sub-region from the 1990s. The national drug policy making process is fragmented. Again, one of the processes that Lee was describing before. The national body that was created actually is a coordinated body for 41 agencies, and essentially not one agency within that process, including the Ministry of Public Security, which was designated the lead agency, has actually the capacity to control what the other agencies involved are doing. These other agencies essentially have their own processes, and the NPS, through that national process, is trying to coordinate what they're doing. That process created a regulatory framework that was meant to shape how all the other agencies would conduct themselves, and that regulatory process has actually incorporated UN rules in relation to programs like the opium substitution program. Specifically for the OSP though, even though there's a national process set up that's already coordinating 41 agencies, a separate process was set up involving 21 agencies, again a very fragmented process known as the 122 work group. Now this process is not led by the Ministry of Public Security, it is actually led by the Ministry of Commerce. And that indicates, of course, the commercial orientation of this process. And that becomes the main regulatory mechanism set up for China's OSPs. What that process does, again, in true regulatory state fashion, it sets broad targets, and then it is up to other agencies, and I'll discuss that in a second, to implement those targets without any specified plans. Now, indicating the importance of commercial goals within that process, the targets that were set were actually about the amount of hectares of plantations planted in other countries. It was not about the amount of opium that will be eradicated, and within that process, the UN principles have actually been neglected. The implementation of this process takes us even further into the bowels of the Chinese-style regulatory state. The implementation was decentralized, in fact, to Yunnan's Department of Commerce. So it wasn't even done by any of those national agencies involved in that process I was just describing. And that agency, the DOC of Yunnan, interpreted, again, one of our three I's, what it actually means to do that work around what are dominant business interests, especially agribusiness interests based within Yunnan province, especially the interests of the rubber sector, very powerful and long-standing important industry within Yunnan. And in the process ignored the Ministry of Public Security guidelines and obviously the UN guidelines that were embedded in that other national process basically set aside. In a nutshell, China's OSPs were hijacked by these cater capitalists that Lee was describing before. In practice, this program was actually run by party-state linked businesses, especially in the rubber sector. They internationalized their operations into northern Myanmar and northern Laos. They're the implementing agencies, and the implementation of this national Chinese program was actually down to them to identify the right locations and to actually engage with counterparts on the ground in order to implement the program. What we find in practice is the commercial interests were trumping strategic ones or even developmental ones, especially when we look at the placement of crops. So instead of choosing a crop that would actually be more suitable for replacing opium, which grows normally between 800 to 1800 meters above sea level, the main crop that was used in the OSPs initially was rubber, for the reason that I just described, even though rubber actually grows in lower altitudes and is not really a suitable crop to replace opium. Slide, please. Thank you. So as Lee described before, based on our framework, the outcome reflects the intersection of this really fragmented, decentralized, and internationalized process within the Chinese party state, and the actors and interests and agendas in the target state where these interventions happen. In the time that I have, I'm just going to focus on one half of this case study, which is Myanmar, rather than on Laos. We can leave that for those who are interested for the Q&A. So the context in Myanmar is, the really important part of the context is the very long-running civil wars in the borderlands between the government, which for many years has been dominated by the military, and ethnic minority armed groups. Most of the opium cultivation that has occurred in Myanmar over the years was actually in the areas that are under the control of these ethnic armed groups. From the 1990s, the government begins to practice what has been described as ceasefire capitalism. It uses a combination of incentives and force to bring a lot of these armed groups into some kind of accommodation with the government. Those who are willing to cooperate are given some autonomy and are able to, in fact, continue to grow drugs or engage in other activities, sometimes in collaboration with government or military, to enrich themselves. Those that do not cooperate are continuously subjected to coercion and force from the government and the military. All that time investment from China and from Chinese and Thai investors has been very important to this process of ceasefire capitalism. It has played a part in that process. From 1999, the government begins on a fairly aggressive campaign of opium eradication, but as I just mentioned, that campaign is mainly directed towards the groups that are not cooperating with the government. Some groups stop basically growing opium and begin to invest leaders of those groups begin to invest their proceeds in other businesses, sometimes recycled through banks that again associated with the ruling elites. So, but the main focus here, as I said, was actually on establishing some control over these groups. It was not really about opium eradication. So it is into this broad context that China's OSP arrives in the 2000s. And essentially we can identify three basic outcomes. The first is that despite initial bilateral agreement between China and Myanmar that a program should take place, oversight from either government or even central agencies from either government over what happened on the ground has actually been minimal in practice. The program in reality has been shaped by a whole range of different agreements between Chinese companies, especially in the rubber sector, as I said, local power brokers that could deliver land and whatever else was needed to these companies, as well as local military commanders and often local leaders from the ethnic armed groups. And therefore, what we find in reality that China's opium substitution program on the ground in Myanmar was it was highly variegated. So it had different outcomes depending on the particular kind of agreement that companies reach with particular power brokers and particular leaders, whether from the military or ethnic armed groups. The plantation themselves, again reflecting the really brutal political economy of that part of Myanmar, were generally established through forceful land grabbing, displacement of the local communities, sometimes forced labor, and in many cases proletarianization of the people who were living there to get them to work on the plantations. All of this is of course in violation of the United Nations principles on how these kinds of activities should happen. So essentially the implementation and the outcomes of this program do not reflect any of the intended outcomes as were stipulated in Beijing, but actually they reflect the foregrounding of these business interests from Yunnan, including the choice of location, which was shaped by the needs of the rubber industry, not by where the opium actually was. And it was also shaped by market dynamics. When rubber prices were going up, there was a lot of interest in spreading these plantations in Myanmar and in Laos, but then the price of rubber crashed in 2011, and consequently a lot of these plantations were abandoned, leaving a lot of local communities in dire straits. And therefore, because these were the actual interests that were shaping this plan, the outcomes actually failed to reduce the cultivation of opium. In fact, it drove, because land was taken away from a lot of communities, it drove many of them into growing opium, which was grown, as I mentioned, in different altitudes anyway from rubber, and consequently it achieved the exact opposite outcome. So what you can see there in front of you in those two graphs is the level of opium production in Myanmar. The yellow highlighted parts in each is the part that is relevant from after the start of the opium substitution program in Myanmar. And as you can see, opium production actually increased in that period largely rather than decrease as anticipated. Slide, please. And as we argue in the book, these problems, this part of the case study you can say relates largely to the period before Xi, because one of the criticisms that we often received was that what you're describing was more appropriate for the pre-Xi time, but now China is not like that. It's a lot more centrally, tightly controlled. Well, we find in this case study, as in our other case studies, that that is not actually reflecting reality. We find that land grabbing under the cover of these programs has continued, but the boom crops have shifted. So initially it was rubber, but then the price of rubber crashed, and then it shifted to bananas because banana was the new boom crop. And we see very similar dynamics playing out in both Myanmar and Laos around banana plantations. Banana plantations added another dimension to the story, a very sad one actually. Because of the very strong chemicals that were being used in order to grow bananas in Myanmar and in Laos, we find many problems of soil degradation, livestock poisoning, water poisoning, and many health problems for the workers who are not given any protective equipment and any clothing to wear, and a very high number of them actually developed cancer. At the same time as all this is happening and it's meant to address the drugs problem, we find that actually trafficking in ATS, amphetamine type stimulants, especially methamphetamine, was actually booming, and most of that was coming from that part of the world into China. So what we're seeing here is clearly not a success, because in its own terms it's actually failed, or at least in the espoused terms, not in the terms of the interests that were dominating the programs. And the explanation that I was describing cannot easily be parsed by either realism or liberalism, but our framework can get to the bottom of it.